There will come a moment so heavy, so unthinkable, that if it were not already spoken by the Messenger of Allah, peace and blessings be upon him, the heart would refuse to accept it. The Kaaba, the sacred house that has stood through centuries of storms, wars, and empires, the center toward which over 1 billion people turn their faces every single day, will one day stand in silence. No footsteps circling it, no voices echoing, Labbaik Allahumma Labbaik, no hands raised in desperate prayer against its walls, just stillness. And then, from that stillness, a man will emerge with a purpose that shakes the foundations of belief itself. But before we continue, take a moment to connect. Thank you for being here with Islamic Insight Channel. Tell us in the comments, which country are you watching from? And if your heart feels something when you hear about these reminders, then subscribe and stay with us on this journey, because what comes next is not just history or prophecy. It is a wake-up call. This is not a story built on imagination or fear. This is a prophecy grounded in the most authentic sources of Islam. The Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, spoke about a man who will come at the end of time, a man known as Dhul-Suwayqatayn, and he described him with a clarity that leaves no room for doubt. In Sahih al-Bukhari, it is narrated that this man will be from Abyssinia and that he will destroy the Kaaba. Let that sink in. The same Kaaba that Allah protected when Abraham marched with an army of elephants, the same Kaaba that has been rebuilt and preserved across generations, will not be saved in that moment. And what makes this even more chilling is the way the Prophet described it. He said this man will dismantle it stone by stone. Not in a sudden explosion of chaos, but slowly, deliberately, as if carrying out a task that no one is left to stop. Every stone removed is like a signal, not just of physical destruction, but of something much deeper. Something that has already been lost long before the first stone falls. And who is this man? The Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, did not leave his identity hidden in vague language. He called him Dhul-Suwayqatayn, a name that points directly to his physical appearance, meaning the one with thin legs or thin shins. This detail is striking because it shows that this is not symbolic or metaphorical. This is a real person who will walk the earth, who will approach the Kaaba with his own hands, and who will carry out this act in full reality. He is described as being from Abyssinia, a region known today as Ethiopia, and its surrounding areas. He is not described as a king or a great leader, or someone with massive armies behind him. Instead, the focus is on his persistence, his physical traits, and the act itself. It is as if the power behind this event does not come from who he is, but from what the world has become when he appears. Because the deeper question is not just about the man, it is about the timing. Why would Allah allow his sacred house to be destroyed after protecting it for so long? The answer lies not in the strength of Dhul-Suwayqatayn, but in the condition of humanity. The scholars explain that this event happens near the end of time, as when faith has weakened to a point almost unimaginable. When the hearts of people are no longer attached to the Kaaba, when its sanctity is no longer honored, when the connection between the people and their Lord has faded. Then the physical structure itself no longer holds the same purpose, and so this man does not arrive in a world full of believers ready to defend it. He arrives in a world that has already let go of what the Kaaba truly represents. That is what makes this prophecy so powerful and so unsettling. It is not just a prediction of destruction, it is a reflection of spiritual collapse. Every time you turn toward the Kaaba in prayer, every time you see images of pilgrims circling it in unity, that every time you feel even a small pull in your heart toward that sacred place, understand that you are witnessing something that will not last forever. The Kaaba stands today, not just because of its stones, but because of the faith of the people. And when that faith disappears, the protection that once came from the heavens will no longer remain in the same way. So the real question is not when this man will come, but whether we are living in a time that is moving closer to that reality. Because the prophecy is not meant to make you afraid of the future. It is meant to make you aware of the present. For as long as human memory can stretch back, the Kaaba has stood not merely as a structure of stone, but as a symbol of something far greater than architecture or history. It is the focal point of submission, saying the axis around which the identity of the believer revolves. Long before the final prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, walked the earth, this sacred house had already been raised by the hands of Ibrahim and his son Ismail. Peace be upon them both, in obedience to a command that carried divine weight. They did not build it as a monument of pride, nor as a display of human achievement, but as a place where the oneness of Allah would be remembered, preserved, and honored across generations. And from that moment, something remarkable began to unfold. Empires rose and fell, tribes clashed and disappeared, entire civilizations faded into dust, yet the Kaaba remained. It stood through storms that would have erased lesser structures, through conflicts that reshaped entire regions, now and through periods of darkness when truth itself seemed to flicker. Still, it stood. That endurance was not random. It was a sign of protection, a quiet but powerful indication that this house was under the care of the one who commanded its construction. The most striking example of that protection is preserved clearly in the Quran itself, in Surah Al-Fil. When Abraha, driven by arrogance and a desire to divert the pilgrimage away from the Kaaba, marched toward Mecca with an army that included massive elephants, the people of the city were powerless. They had no army capable of resisting such force, no strategy that could repel such an invasion. By every worldly measure, the Kaaba should have been destroyed that day. But what unfolded instead was something that continues to echo through time. Allah sent birds in flocks, as each carrying small stones, and those stones struck the army with precision, leaving them broken and defeated. The threat was erased not through human effort, but through divine intervention. That moment established a truth that would settle deep into the hearts of believers. The Kaaba is not preserved by human strength. It is preserved by the will of Allah. And as long as that will remains connected to the condition of the people, no force on earth can bring it down. But here is where the narrative takes a turn that demands reflection. The protection of the Kaaba, as the scholars have explained, is not unconditional in the sense that it exists independent of the state of humanity. Rather, it is tied to the purpose for which the Kaaba was built. It was raised as a center of Tawheed, a place where people would gather in sincere worship, where hearts would be humbled, and where the remembrance of Allah would be alive and constant. As long as that purpose is upheld, as long as there are people who honor it, who travel across lands to stand before it with sincerity, who weep in its presence and call upon their Lord with humility, then the protection remains active in a way that defies all worldly logic. But what happens when that purpose begins to fade? What happens when the connection between the people and the sacred begins to weaken? Not outwardly at first, but inwardly, in the unseen corners of the heart. The prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, pointed toward a future where this weakening becomes so severe that the very essence of what the Kaaba represents is no longer alive within the people. It is not that the structure disappears overnight, nor that its physical presence is suddenly erased. It remains standing, but something more important begins to disappear. Reverence fades, the sense of awe diminishes. The deep, trembling awareness that this is the house of Allah starts to slip away from the hearts of those who look upon it. And when that internal connection erodes, the external form begins to lose its purpose. This is not a sudden collapse, but a gradual drift, a slow distancing that happens over time as distractions increase, as sincerity weakens, and as the priorities of people shift toward the temporary rather than the eternal. Imagine a time when the journey of Hajj is no longer filled with the same longing, when the sight of the Kaaba no longer brings tears to the eyes, when the rituals become hollow movements rather than acts of deep submission. Imagine a world where the Kaaba is still there, but the people around it no longer carry the same spirit that once filled its surroundings with life. The Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, indicated that such a time will come, and it will reach a point where the Kaaba stands without the presence of those who truly honor it. No crowds dressed in simple garments, moving in unity. No voices rising together in remembrance. No overwhelming sense of belonging to something greater than oneself. Just a structure, standing in a world that has lost its connection to what that structure was meant to represent. And this is where the reality becomes even more sobering. The lifting of divine protection is not an act of abandonment without reason. It is a consequence of a deeper shift. And when the people no longer uphold the sanctity of what Allah has made sacred, when the connection between the Creator and His creation becomes weak to the point of near disappearance, then the signs that once stood as reminders begin to lose their function. The Kaaba does not lose its importance in the sight of Allah, but its role as a living center of guidance among people diminishes when people themselves no longer respond to that guidance. It becomes a symbol without an audience that understands it, a sacred place in a world that no longer treats it as sacred. The Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, described that before the final destruction takes place, there will be a time when the Kaaba is not visited in the way it once was. The flow of pilgrims ceases, the rituals fade, and the presence that once defined it disappears. And this is not just a physical emptiness, but a spiritual one. The absence of believers is not merely about numbers, but about the absence of sincerity, of devotion, of hearts that are alive with faith. And when that emptiness settles fully, when the Kaaba stands without the honor that once surrounded it, then the stage is set for what comes next. This is the context in which Dhul-Suwayqatayn appears. He does not arrive in a time of strength, nor in a time when the Kaaba is defended by the hearts and actions of believers. He arrives in a time of absence, a time when the protection that once repelled entire armies is no longer manifest in the same way, because the condition that sustained it has changed. The destruction that follows is not a contradiction of Allah's protection, but a reflection of a world that has moved so far from its purpose that even the most sacred symbol is no longer preserved in its physical form. What makes this deeply powerful is the realization that the Kaaba, as it stands today, is more than just a place to visit or a direction to face. It is a living reminder of a connection that still exists, a connection that is still available, still open, still waiting to be strengthened. The crowds that gather around it, the prayers that are directed toward it, the longing that people feel to stand before it, all of this is evidence that the purpose for which it was built is still alive. But the prophecy serves as a reminder that this will not always be the case. The presence of the Kaaba in its current state is not guaranteed forever. And the opportunity to be among those who honor it is something that exists within a limited window of time. So when you think about the Kaaba, do not think of it only as a distant place or a ritual obligation. Think of it as a measure of something much deeper. As long as it is filled with believers, as long as it is surrounded by sincere hearts, as long as it continues to be a center of living faith, then it stands not just as a structure, but as a sign that the connection between humanity and its Creator is still intact. And the moment that connection fades completely, the physical structure will follow. What makes this prophecy even more unsettling is not just the fact that the Kaaba will be destroyed, but the way in which that destruction is described. The Messenger of Allah, peace and blessings be upon him, I did not portray a sudden collapse, nor a violent explosion that reduces everything to dust in a single moment. Instead, he described something far more deliberate, far more controlled, and in many ways, far more disturbing. This man, Dhul-Suwayqatayn, will approach the Kaaba and begin to dismantle it stone by stone. Each movement intentional, each action carried out with a strange persistence, as if he is not acting out of chaos, but out of a purpose that has already taken hold of him. Imagine the weight of that image. A structure that has stood for thousands of years, a place where prophets walked, where prayers were raised, where generations of believers poured out their hearts, being taken apart piece by human hands. There is something deeply symbolic in that method. It is not a reckless act. It is not the kind of destruction that comes from overwhelming force or blind rage. It is slow, measured, almost surgical in its precision, as if every stone removed represents something that had already been removed from the hearts of people long before. Because by the time this event takes place, the Kaaba is no longer surrounded by those who would give everything to protect it. There are no crowds rushing forward to defend it, no voices rising in protest, no resistance that echoes the love that once defined the relationship between the believers in this sacred house. Instead, there is a silence that speaks louder than any destruction. A silence that reveals that what has been lost is not just physical protection, but spiritual connection. The Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, had described that this man will strip the Kaaba of its covering, remove its adornments, and continue until nothing remains. This is not just the removal of stones, it is the unraveling of something that once held immense meaning for humanity. And yet, what makes this even more chilling is that it will happen in a world that no longer recognizes the magnitude of what is being lost. The Kaaba will not fall in a time when believers are standing shoulder to shoulder in devotion. It will fall in a time when the absence of that devotion has already created a void. The physical act becomes almost secondary to the deeper reality that made it possible. And then comes the realization that this event is not isolated. It is not a random moment in history that can be separated from everything else. It is part of a sequence, knows a chain of signs that point toward something far greater. The destruction of the Kaaba is counted among the major signs of the last day, and that alone should be enough to shake the heart into awareness. When the central symbol of Islamic worship is removed from the earth, it signals that the world is approaching its final stage. The direction toward which millions have turned in prayer 5 times a day, across every continent, across every generation, will no longer exist in its physical form. That reality is almost impossible to fully grasp because it touches something so deeply rooted in the identity of a believer. Think about what the Kaaba represents in daily life. From the moment a person learns to pray, they are taught to face it. No matter where they are in the world, no matter how far they are from Makkah, till their body aligns toward that sacred point, it becomes a constant, a fixed direction that connects them to a global community and to a shared act of submission. Now imagine a world where that direction no longer has a physical anchor, where the place that once unified the prayers of the believers has been reduced to nothing. It is not just the loss of a structure. It is the removal of a central point of connection, a sign that the world itself is being stripped of the elements that once guided it. This is why the scholars have always emphasized that the destruction of the Kaaba is not just about the building itself. It is about what it represents and what its absence signifies. When this event occurs, it means that the world has reached a state where guidance is no longer being sought, saying where the connection between humanity and its creator has been severed to such an extent that even the most sacred symbol is no longer preserved. It is as if the final chapter has begun to unfold, and the signs are no longer subtle or distant, but direct and undeniable. And yet, within this heavy reality, there is a layer of understanding that brings clarity to the believer. This event does not occur in a time where faith is strong and thriving. It does not happen while there are still people who truly carry the light of belief within them. The Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, made it clear that before these final signs take place, Allah will send a wind that will take the souls of every believer, leaving behind only those who have turned away completely. So when Dhul-Suwayqatayn carries out this act, he does so in a world that has already been emptied of those who would feel the weight of it. The Kaaba is dismantled not in front of the believers, but in their absence. That detail changes everything. It shows that the destruction is not a punishment upon the righteous, nor a test for those who hold firm to their faith. It is a consequence that unfolds in a world where the very foundation of faith has already been removed. The absence of believers is not just a background detail. It is the condition that allows this event to happen. Without that absence, the story would be entirely different, but with it, the meaning becomes clear. The Kaaba stands as long as there are hearts that honor it. And when those hearts are no longer present, the structure itself no longer remains. So when you reflect on this prophecy, do not focus only on the image of destruction. Look deeper into what it represents. It is a mirror held up to humanity, showing what happens when the connection to the sacred is lost. It is a reminder that the physical world is tied to the spiritual state of those who live within it. And it is a call to recognize the value of what still exists today. Because right now, the Kaaba still stands. It is still surrounded by believers. It is still the center of prayer, of longing, of devotion. And that means something powerful. It means that the time of that final destruction has not yet come, and that the opportunity to be among those who honor it is still open. But that opportunity is not endless. The prophecy makes it clear that there will come a moment when that door closes, when the connection fades, tires, and when the signs begin to unfold in ways that cannot be reversed. And when that moment arrives, the dismantling of the Kaaba will not just be an event in history. It will be a declaration that the world has reached its final stage, and that everything that follows will move swiftly toward the end. One of the most haunting aspects of this prophecy is not the act of destruction itself, but the silence surrounding it. The mind naturally asks a question that refuses to settle easily. Where are the believers when this happens? Where are the hearts that once trembled at the sight of the Kaaba, the voices that once filled its surroundings with remembrance, the people who would have given everything to protect it? The answer, as revealed through the words of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, is both profound and deeply sobering. By the time these final events unfold, the believers are no longer there. They are not standing at a distance, watching helplessly, nor are they overwhelmed and defeated. They have already been taken from this world through a mercy that many might not immediately recognize as mercy. The Messenger of Allah, peace and blessings be upon him, described that near the end of time, Allah will send a gentle wind that will pass across the earth, and it will take the soul of every person who has even the smallest trace of faith in their heart. This wind will not be violent or terrifying. It will not announce itself with chaos or destruction. It will come quietly, almost gently, and one by one, the believers will pass from this world. The righteous, the sincere, those who carried even a flicker of iman within them, will be removed before the final darkness settles over the earth. This detail changes the entire emotional weight of what follows. Because it means that the destruction of the Kaaba does not happen in a world where faith is still alive. It happens in a world that has already been emptied of it. Imagine that reality for a moment. A world where no one says the name of Allah with sincerity. A world where no one wakes up before dawn to pray, where no one turns their face toward the Kaaba in submission, where no one feels the pull of Hajj or the longing to stand in that sacred place. The absence is not just physical. It is spiritual, emotional, and complete. The believers are gone, not because they were defeated, but because Allah chose to spare them from witnessing what comes next. There is a deep mercy in that removal. To see the Kaaba destroyed, to live in a world where the sacred has been erased, would be a burden too heavy for hearts that are alive with faith. So Allah takes those hearts away before that moment arrives. And what remains after that? The Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, described that only the worst of people will be left on the earth. Not simply people who make mistakes or struggle with sin, but those who have no connection to their Creator at all. People whose hearts are hardened, whose priorities are entirely rooted in the temporary world, and who no longer recognize or respect anything sacred. In such a world, the Kaaba is no longer seen as the house of Allah. It becomes, in their eyes, nothing more than a structure of stone, stripped of its meaning, stripped of its significance. And when that perception takes hold across humanity, the conditions that once protected it no longer exist. This is why the destruction of the Kaaba is not described as a battle or a conflict. There is no resistance because there is no one left who truly cares. The silence is not the result of fear. It is the result of absence. The absence of faith, the absence of reverence, the absence of hearts that would have stood in its defense. And that silence is perhaps more chilling than the act itself, because it reveals that the true loss did not begin when the first stone was removed. It began long before, when the connection between people and their Lord started to fade, when the sacred was gradually replaced by the trivial, and when the focus of humanity shifted entirely toward the temporary. In contrast to this final scene, that it becomes essential to remember how the Kaaba came into existence in the first place. This was not a structure built by accident or by human ambition. It was raised by Ibrahim, peace be upon him, under divine command, alongside his son Ismail. The Quran captures the moment with a sense of humility that is almost overwhelming. As they raised the foundations of the house, they were not celebrating their accomplishment or claiming ownership over what they had built. Instead, they were making dua, asking Allah to accept it from them, acknowledging that even this act of obedience required His acceptance to have any value. That moment set the tone for what the Kaaba represents. It is not a monument to human effort. It is a symbol of submission, of obedience, of a relationship between the servant and the Creator. For thousands of years, that relationship remained alive through the Kaaba. It became the center of Tawheed, the place where people would gather to affirm the oneness of Allah, to reject all forms of association, and to renew their commitment to a path of guidance. Even when deviations occurred, even when idols were placed around it before the coming of Islam, the Kaaba itself remained a focal point that was eventually purified and restored to its original purpose by the Prophet Muhammad. Peace and blessings be upon him. From that moment onward, it stood as a clear and unshakable symbol of pure monotheism, a place where the unity of believers could be seen in its most powerful form. So when the prophecy speaks of its destruction, it is not simply describing the end of a building. It is describing the conclusion of a long and sacred history. A history that began with prophets and continued through generations of believers who held on to its meaning. The removal of the Kaaba from the earth is like the closing of a chapter that has defined the spiritual direction of humanity for millennia. It is a sign that the role it once played is no longer needed in a world that has turned away from what it represents. And yet, within this realization, there is a message that speaks directly to the present moment. The legacy of Ibrahim is not just something to be remembered as history. It is something to be lived. The Kaaba still stands today as a continuation of that legacy, as a reminder that the call to worship Allah alone is still active, still relevant, still open to anyone who chooses to respond. The fact that millions continue to face it in prayer, and that people travel from every corner of the earth to stand before it, that hearts still feel a deep and unexplainable connection to it, is proof that the purpose for which it was built is still alive. But the prophecy reminds us that this will not always be the case. There will come a time when that connection fades completely, when the legacy is no longer carried by the people, and when the physical symbol is no longer preserved. That is what makes this warning so powerful. It is not just about the future. It is about the present. It is about recognizing the value of what still exists, and understanding that the opportunity to be part of that living legacy is something that should never be taken for granted. Because when the Kaaba is finally dismantled, it will not just mark the end of a structure. It will mark the end of an era. Name the end of a connection that once defined the relationship between humanity and its creator on a global scale. And by that point, the only ones left to witness it will be those who no longer understand what has been lost. What makes this prophecy truly heavy is not only what will happen, but why it will happen. When the Kaaba is finally dismantled, when its stones are removed and its structure erased from the earth, the deeper tragedy is not in the physical loss. Stones can be rebuilt, structures can be restored. History has shown that again and again. But what cannot be rebuilt so easily is the condition of the human heart once it has turned away completely. The destruction of the Kaaba is not the beginning of loss. It is the final evidence that the loss has already taken place within people long before that moment ever arrives. It is the visible result of an invisible collapse that has been unfolding quietly, slowly, and almost unnoticed. The sacred does not lose its value in the sight of Allah. The Kaaba does not become less important because it is destroyed. Rather, it is the people who lose their ability to recognize its importance. And that is the real weight of this moment. Because when something as central, as powerful, and as deeply rooted as the Kaaba becomes insignificant in the eyes of humanity, it reveals a level of spiritual emptiness that is difficult to comprehend. It means that the connection to Allah has been weakened to such an extent that even the most visible and undeniable symbol of that connection no longer holds meaning. Think about how the sacred is treated today. Even now, in a time when the Kaaba is still honored, there are already signs of distraction, signs of weakening focus, signs that the world is pulling hearts in directions that are far removed from remembrance. The pace of life increases, priorities shift, attention becomes scattered, and slowly, without people realizing it, the depth of their connection begins to fade. It does not disappear overnight. It fades in small ways, in moments that seem insignificant on their own but accumulate over time. A missed prayer here, a distracted intention there, a gradual shift in what matters most. And if that process continues unchecked across generations, it leads to a point where the sacred is no longer central, but peripheral. Not rejected outright, but quietly neglected. This is the kind of neglect that carries consequences far greater than people expect. Because the Kaaba was never meant to be just a structure that people admire from a distance. It was meant to be a living center of worship, a place that reflects the state of the Ummah, a symbol that draws hearts back to their Creator again and again. When that reflection becomes weak, when the connection it represents is no longer alive within people, the structure itself loses its function in the world. It remains physically present for a time, but its purpose becomes hollow, like a shell without what once gave it life. And this is why the scholars have always emphasized that the real danger is not the destruction of the Kaaba, but the path that leads to it, the slow erosion of sincerity, the quiet replacement of remembrance with distraction, the gradual shift from living for the hereafter to becoming consumed by the temporary world. These are not dramatic changes that people immediately notice. They are subtle, almost invisible at first, but they grow stronger with time. And if they are not corrected, they lead to a state where the sacred no longer holds its place in the hearts of people. The prophecy, then, becomes more than just a description of a future event. It becomes a mirror reflecting a potential future that is shaped by the choices of humanity. It asks a question that is both simple and deeply challenging. What happens when people stop honoring what Allah has made sacred? What happens when the connection between the Creator and the creation is no longer nurtured, no longer protected, no longer valued? The answer is not immediate destruction. The answer is a gradual decline that eventually reaches a point of no return. And at that point, the external signs begin to disappear because their purpose is no longer being fulfilled. Yet within this heavy message, there is also a powerful reminder for the present. The Kaaba still stands. It is still visited. it is still surrounded by believers whose hearts are alive with faith. The call to prayer still echoes across the world, and millions still turn toward that sacred direction every single day. That reality is not something to overlook or take lightly. It is evidence that the connection is still there, that the opportunity to strengthen it still exists, and that the path toward Allah is still open. Every prayer offered with sincerity, every moment of remembrance, every effort to draw closer to Allah is part of what keeps that connection alive. It is part of what gives meaning to the Kaaba as more than just a structure. Because in the end, the Kaaba is not the source of faith. It is a symbol of it, and as long as that faith exists within people, the symbol continues to hold its place in the world. This is where the message becomes personal. It is easy to hear about a prophecy like this and think of it as something distant, something that belongs to a time far removed from the present. But the truth is that the path toward that future is shaped by what happens now. It is shaped by the state of the hearts that exist today, by the choices people make, by the priorities they hold. The decline does not begin in some distant era. It begins wherever the connection to Allah begins to weaken. So the question is no longer just about what will happen in the future. The question becomes about what is happening right now. And are hearts still attached to the Kaaba in the way they were meant to be? Is the remembrance of Allah still central, or has it become something secondary? Are people living with a sense of purpose that connects them to something greater, or are they becoming absorbed in a world that constantly pulls them away from that connection? These are not questions meant to create fear, but awareness. Because awareness is the first step toward change. The prophecy is not meant to leave people feeling helpless. It is meant to remind them of what is at stake and what is still within their control. The Kaaba stands today as a sign, a living reminder of a connection that still exists. And as long as that sign remains, the opportunity to strengthen that connection remains as well. But that opportunity is not endless. The warning makes it clear that there will come a time when the sacred is no longer honored, when the connection fades completely, and when the signs begin to disappear one by one. And when that moment arrives, there will be no turning back. The Kaaba will be dismantled, not as an isolated act, but as the final confirmation that something much deeper has already been lost. Until that day comes, the responsibility remains to recognize the value of what exists, to protect the connection that gives it meaning, and to ensure that the sacred does not become ordinary in the eyes of those who still have the chance to honor it. There is a layer of this prophecy that at first feels overwhelming, but when understood properly, reveals a depth of mercy that is easy to miss. The idea that the Kaaba will be destroyed, that the world will reach such a state of spiritual emptiness, can weigh heavily on the heart. But the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, did not leave this narrative without clarity. He made it known that the believers will not be present to witness that moment. Before the final darkness settles, before the sacred is stripped away from the earth, Allah will remove those whose hearts are still alive with faith. This is not abandonment. This is protection of a different kind. It is a mercy that shields the believers from seeing a reality that would shake them to their core. It is as if Allah, in His wisdom, chooses not to let the hearts that loved Him experience a world where His remembrance has completely disappeared. This changes the way the entire prophecy is understood, because it means that the destruction of the Kaaba is not something that the righteous will suffer through. It is something that unfolds after they have already been honored with a departure from this world. The wind that takes the souls of the believers is described as gentle, almost comforting, a transition that removes them from a world that is no longer suitable for hearts that recognize the truth. And once they are gone, what remains is a version of humanity that has disconnected itself entirely from its Creator. In that sense, the removal of the believers is not just an event that happens before the destruction. It is the final separation between two realities, one that was anchored in faith and one that continues without it. And what follows after that separation is not simply a continuation of life as it is known today. And it is a transformation of the world into something far more hollow. Without believers, the world loses its balance. The remembrance of Allah is no longer present in daily life. There are no voices reciting the Quran with sincerity, no hearts turning in repentance, no acts of worship that carry meaning beyond habit or imitation. What remains is a society that functions on the surface, but is empty at its core. The structure of life continues, but the purpose that once gave it direction is gone. And in that environment, the Kaaba no longer holds its place as a center of guidance, because there are no longer hearts that seek guidance from it. This is where the final chapter of the world begins to unfold in a way that is both subtle and overwhelming. The major signs of the last day do not appear all at once, but when they begin, they follow one another with increasing intensity. The destruction of the Kaaba is one of those signs that signals that the process is well underway. It is not the beginning, but it is certainly not the end either. It sits within a sequence of events that move the world closer and closer to its conclusion. The boundaries between what was once stable begin to shift. The sense of normalcy fades, and the world moves into a phase where the signs are no longer distant warnings, but immediate realities. In such a world, time itself seems to carry a different weight. The distractions that once consumed people remain, but they no longer mask the deeper emptiness that has taken hold. There is no sense of accountability, no awareness of a greater purpose, no recognition of the hereafter. Life becomes entirely centered on the immediate, on the temporary, the visible. And without the presence of faith, even those things begin to lose their meaning. Because without a connection to something beyond this world, the world itself becomes insufficient. It cannot fulfill the deeper needs of the human soul, and yet there is no longer any awareness of what is missing. The Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, described that the hour will come upon the worst of people. This is not simply a statement about morality. It is a description of a state of existence where the connection to Allah has been completely severed. These are people who do not recognize truth, who do not seek guidance, who do not respond to reminders. They live, but without direction. They act, but without purpose. And in that state, the final events unfold, on leading toward the moment when the world itself comes to an end. But all of this, as heavy as it may sound, is not meant to leave the listener in a state of despair. It is meant to create clarity. Because when you understand where the path leads, you begin to see the value of where you are right now. The Kaaba still stands, the call to prayer still rises, the Quran is still recited, the path to Allah is still open. These are not small things. They are signs that the connection between humanity and its Creator is still alive, still accessible, still within reach for anyone who chooses to hold on to it. And this is where the message becomes deeply personal. It is no longer just about what will happen in the future. It is about what is happening within you right now. Because the same principle that applies to humanity as a whole applies to the individual as well. When the connection to Allah is strong, life has direction, meaning, and purpose. When that connection weakens, those elements begin to fade. And if it is neglected entirely, the heart becomes empty, even if everything else appears to be in place. The Kaaba, in this sense, is more than a physical structure. It is a reminder of orientation. Just as the body turns toward it in prayer, the heart is meant to turn toward Allah in every aspect of life. It is a constant reference point, a way of aligning oneself with something greater than the distractions of the world. And as long as that alignment exists, there is stability. There is clarity. There is a sense of belonging that cannot be replaced by anything else. So when you hear about the day when the Kaaba will no longer stand, do not let your focus remain on the loss that will occur in the future. Let it bring your attention to the opportunity that exists in the present. Because right now, You still have the ability to turn toward it. You still have the ability to strengthen your connection, to deepen your understanding, to live in a way that reflects the purpose for which it was built. And perhaps that is the most powerful part of this entire prophecy. It does not just describe an ending, it highlights a choice that exists today, in every moment, in every action. To be among those who honor what Allah has made sacred, or to slowly drift away from it until it no longer holds meaning. The future described in these narrations is not random. It is the result of a path. And every path is made up of individual steps. So the question is not just what will happen when the Kaaba is destroyed. The question is where you stand before that day ever comes. Because the silence that will one day surround it has not yet arrived. The voices are still there. The prayers are still being made. The connection is still alive. And as long as that is true, the door has not closed. But one day, it will.